There's this young salesman on Wall Street. He's fidgety, he's nervous. Rightly so, because his boss is one of the most powerful bankers in America. Now, one day, the salesman notices that his boss's pants were unbuttoned. He doesn't want his boss to feel embarrassed, so he discreetly pulls him to a corner and quietly tells him. But his boss's reaction was anything but positive. He looks at the salesman and two words just come out of his mouth.
"You're fired."
Sounds like a real piece of work, right? Ruthless. But what's surprising is that this mean, hardcore boss was usually called Sunshine Charlie Mitchell, a cute nickname to refer to his optimism and positive nature. But if you dig deep enough to figure out what made this so-called Sunshine Charlie so ruthless and heartless, you'll find a much darker story under the surface. So let's talk about that story of how good old Charlie would take advantage of ordinary Americans and help trigger one of the worst financial disasters in American history. In the early 1920s, at 55 years old, Charles Mitchell had a realization. He saw an opportunity in the masses, the average hardworking American. At that time, the usual practice for elite bankers was to focus only on wealthy clients and corporate deals. But Charlie thought of the 6 million New Yorkers, ordinary people with modest savings and big dreams. You see, Charlie had grown up poor in an underwhelming suburb of Boston. He had an average childhood. Maybe that's why he understood the psychology of average people, those who just wanted a bit more out of life. He wanted to use this insight to his advantage. Charlie's vision was quite revolutionary. His idea was simple. What if you could take the broad customer base of a commercial bank, the average Joes, and convince those guys to buy into high-margin securities that investment banks would usually sell only to the wealthy? What if you could democratize Wall Street, bring financial products that were meant for the elites, but make them available to everybody? He worked on his plan to bring financial products to the masses. And this was happening while America was undergoing a transformation. The end of World War I had unleashed a wave of consumer spending unlike anything the country had ever seen. For the first time in history, ordinary Americans had disposable income, but more importantly, they also had access to credit. Department stores were expanding, automobiles were becoming more affordable, and this new invention called the radio was now bringing entertainment information, but more importantly, ads, into homes across the country. As Americans became more consumeristic, they were also developing a new relationship with debt and the concept of investments. You see, the government's Liberty Bond campaigns during the war had introduced millions of people to the concept of putting money into financial instruments. So the foundation was being led for what would end up becoming a national gambling addiction. And Charlie Mitchell was about to become America's biggest dealer. Charlie's first step was transforming the sleepy National City Bank into something unprecedented, a financial supermarket that combined traditional banking with aggressive securities sales. He created an affiliate bank and called it the National City Company, which would only focus on selling stocks and bonds, while the main bank, National City Bank, would handle deposits and loans. And so the structure and the foundation was built. Next, Charlie focused on building the most sophisticated sales force in financial history. He built a massive sales organization with offices in 58 cities from coast to coast, with around 1,400 employees, 350 of whom were full-time salesmen. And when I say salesmen, I mean it. They weren't your typical bankers. They literally went door to door. If you're picturing like a vacuum cleaner sales guy back in the day, you're on the right track. And Charlie's training methods for these salesmen were absolutely brutal. He would humiliate, berate, and threaten these sales guys if their performance dipped even a little bit. Charlie's masterstroke was recognizing the power of mass advertising to reach customers at scale. If you think about ads today, I think we can all agree that we're mostly skeptical, right? We look at reviews and a bunch of other factors instead of just relying on the content of the ad. But back in the 20s, things were different because Americans viewed advertising as honest. They didn't question these ads and mostly thought that ads were factual, kind of like the news. And so National City's ads started appearing in magazines across the country and also on the radio. These ads had beautiful imagery and reassuring language that positioned the bank as a trusted friend and an advisor. The ads for National City claimed that their standards of security and financial analysis are very strict, and so to just trust their judgment when they recommend a product for customers to buy. And most people just bought it, they took their word for it. And some ads would go so far as to ask customers to discuss their investment ideas with National City salesmen in the same way that people trust lawyers or doctors. But the sad reality was that the response to these marketing campaigns exceeded Charlie's expectations. Middle-class Americans who had never owned a stock in their lives began investing their children's college funds and retirement savings into products that they never understood. Farmers were mortgaging their land to buy securities, and teachers spent their life savings on bonds from countries that they couldn't even locate on a map. These new investors were driven by a potent combination of greed and fear. Greed for the quick profits that they saw their neighbors making, and good old FOMO, fear of missing out on what seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Lords of Finance, Liaquat Ahamed tries to explain this mindset. He said, "Watching other people becoming rich is not much fun, especially if they do it overnight and without any effort." So you kind of understand the sentiments over here. But hold on, it gets worse, because Charlie's salesmen would target vulnerable populations as well, like widows with insurance settlements or retirees with savings, and even newer immigrants who trusted the authority of a major American bank. These customers had little financial sophistications and had no way to evaluate the complex securities that were being sold to them. What Charlie's customers didn't know was that many of the securities that they were buying were essentially worthless. According to Liaquat Ahmed that I mentioned earlier, National City sold $15 billion worth of securities in 9 years. This included stocks of automobile companies which almost immediately went broke. It also included bonds of South American republics which were on the verge of insolvency. Even the bank's internal documents show that Charlie and his team knew exactly how risky these investments were. These documents were eventually released during congressional investigations. As long as the sales commissions kept flowing, National City continued to push worthless securities onto trusting customers. Charlie's philosophy was brutally simple: let the buyer beware. He also said things like, "You cannot wet nurse people from the time they're born until the day they die." In simple terms, his belief was that if customers were stupid enough to trust a banker's investment advice, then they deserved what happened to them. And the culture in Charlie's organization also pushed this kind of a mindset. To motivate his sales force, Charlie rewarded short-term profits over long-term welfare. The bank's officers received bonuses based on the volume of securities sold, instead of the quality and the performance of said security. Between 1927 and 29, Charlie earned over $3.5 million. To give you an idea of how much this meant, know that the average American earned less than $1,000 per year. This incentive structure created a culture where salesmen were rewarded for pushing the most profitable securities, regardless of how appropriate they were for their customers. Later on, an investigator would look into this financial crisis. His name is Ferdinand Pecora. We're going to talk about him quite a bit later on, so stay tuned. But in his words, this was, quote, "a gigantic, foolproof device for gambling freely with the stockholders' money, taking huge profits when the gambles won, and risking not a penny of their own money if they lost." By the time 1928 came around, some observers were beginning to notice dangerous signs in the American economy. The Federal Reserve was growing concerned about the massive amount of money flowing into stock speculation. A large chunk of this was borrowed from banks like National City. European economists warned that American stock prices had risen far beyond any rational relationship to corporate earnings. By the way, Jesse Livermore, another banker, took advantage of this very phenomenon, and I made a video about him which you can check it out over here. But the warnings from Europe were drowned out by a chorus of optimism from Wall Street cheerleaders like Charlie Mitchell. His nickname, Sunshine Charlie, was probably given because of this very optimism, for his always positive outlook on the American stock market. When the Federal Reserve attempted to cool speculation by discouraging banks from lending so much money for stock purchases, Charlie publicly defied them. He announced that National City would make $25 million available for stock speculation, regardless of federal warnings. Charlie's defiance was seen as heroic by many, but it also demonstrated how completely the banking system had spun out of control, with individual bankers believing that they were more powerful than the federal government itself. The speculative bubble would eventually burst because on October 24th, 1929, which we now know today as Black Thursday, Charlie's world would begin to collapse. The stock market that morning opened in a freefall. When people heard the news, their gut instinct was to cut their losses as soon as possible and sell. So panic selling spread from Wall Street to the exchanges across the country and eventually around the world. Trying to figure out a solution, Charlie rushed to the offices of JP Morgan, where the most powerful bankers in America convened in an emergency session. In that meeting, they assembled a pool of $100 million at that time to support falling prices. And from that meeting, Charlie emerged with his characteristic smile. He was telling reporters that everything was going to be fine, nothing to worry about. I mean, his name was Sunshine Charlie for a reason. But privately, he was facing his own crisis. National City's stock price was plummeting, and this was threatening to destroy a merger deal that was supposed to be a crowning achievement of Charlie's career. So he was desperate to save that deal, so he went to JP Morgan and asked for $12 million just to buy back his own bank stock, which would artificially improve the stock's price. This move would later be seen as a symbol of Wall Street's reckless self-dealing and self-protection. As the market continued to collapse, ordinary Americans began to realize the magnitude of their losses. The farmers who had mortgaged their land, the teachers who had invested their pensions, and the widows who had trusted Charlie's advertisements, they were all wiped out. Letters poured into National City from devastated customers pleading for help. As America slid into the Great Depression, public anger began to focus on the bankers who had caused this disaster. They wanted someone to blame and hold accountable, and rightly so. By 1932, unemployment had reached 25% and 5,000 banks had failed. Looking for answers, Congress authorized an investigation into Wall Street practices. But this didn't scare Charlie and the other bankers. They were confident that they could weather any kind of congressional hearing. But the bankers should have taken this more seriously, because in January 1933, the investigation got a new chief counsel. Remember I mentioned his name before? Ferdinand Pecora. He was a tenacious Italian-American prosecutor who had built his reputation for exposing corruption in New York. And what made Pecora truly dangerous was that he actually understood finance really well and wasn't intimidated by these powerful bankers. On February 21, 1933, Charlie Mitchell was summoned to room 301 of the Senate office building. But he wasn't worried, thinking that these lawyers would never be able to understand the complex world of finance. In his mind, this would be a walk in the park. But Ferdinand Pecora brought his receipts, literally. He spent 3 full days studying National City's internal documents and uncovered a pattern of deception and self-dealing that went to the very top of the organization. Pecora knew exactly what questions to ask and what answers he would get. For 4 hours that day, Pecora questioned Charlie and destroyed his reputation. Pecora revealed one by one all the corrupt practices that had made National City profitable. Charlie was forced to admit that the bank had sold worthless securities while hiding their true nature from customers. He was forced to acknowledge receiving enormous bonuses even after the crash had wiped out the bank's profits. But Pecora saved his most devastating revelation for last. After careful examination of Charlie's personal financial records, the prosecutor discovered that Charlie had engaged in a sham transaction to avoid paying taxes on his 1929 bonuses, the year of the crash. He sold millions of dollars worth of National City stock to his wife at the end of the year, creating an artificial loss that reduced his tax liability. And then in early 1930, he brought back the same stock at exactly the same price. There was no economic purpose to this transaction. It was pure and simple tax evasion. Pecora forced Charlie to admit this in front of a room full of reporters and senators. His name was Sunshine Charlie after all, with that classic grin and that trusting smile. And that was all the more reason why America was outraged when he confessed cheating on his taxes, while ordinary Americans were struggling with their life, losing their life savings. The reaction to Charlie's testimony was explosive. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories. Reporters compared Charlie to robber barons of the Gilded Age, while political cartoonists drew him as a vulture feeding on the corpses of ruined investors. This was a man who was once celebrated as a financial genius, and now he was seen as a symbol of everything wrong with American capitalism. One silver lining from all of this, if you look really hard, is that Charlie's downfall created momentum on the financial reforms that would reshape American banking. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking, preventing future Charlie Mitchells from using depositors' money to speculate in securities. And the Securities Act required honest disclosure of investment risks, ending an era of misleading advertisements and high-pressure sales tactics. Within days of his testimony, Charlie's board of directors at National City forced him to resign. The banking empire that he had built over 2 decades crumbled within a matter of weeks, and his name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Charlie's personal downfall was just the beginning. The investigation he had triggered would continue for months, exposing corruption throughout the financial system and leading the most comprehensive banking reforms in American history. But remember how we discussed the power of ads and marketing at that time? Well, the advertising and marketing techniques that Charlie had pioneered had proved more durable. Charlie's insight that ordinary Americans could be easily convinced to make complex financial decisions based on emotional appeals rather than rational analysis would be rediscovered for generations to come. I mean, the same psychological psychological tricks that Charlie had used to sell worthless bonds in the 1920s would later be used to sell subprime mortgages in the 2000s, and we all know how that story ends. In his final years, Charlie Mitchell lived in relative obscurity, working as an investment advisor, rebuilding his reputation. But he never fully acknowledged the damage his practices had caused. He maintained until his death that he had been unfairly scapegoated for a broader economic problem beyond his control. Charlie died at 1955 at the age of 77, largely forgotten. But his story remained a cautionary tale about what happens when financial institutions prioritize profits over customer welfare and where regulators allow powerful interests to police themselves. In the end, Sunshine Charlie's greatest achievement may have been inadvertent. Unknowingly, he brought focus on the dishonesty and the recklessness of the banking industry and forced lawmakers to create legal frameworks that protected American investors for generations to come.